And unfortunately, the peak capacity of a commuter rail is similar to the peak capacity of a high-speed rail. It does not mean, again, that we do not want to move in this direction. Again, we've got limited capacity. We want to see whether we can use some of that limited capacity, and Caltrain is working with us. So we can use maybe 1 or 2 trains per hour and get high speed up and running in the corridor. But our main aspects remain the ones that, how do we meet the 30-minute time between San Jose to, because today it's 57 minutes. How do we meet the transition, the Prop 1A transition of the stations, which basically you need to reduce the time?
Does Prop 1A call out how many trains have to make it in that time?
In the time, no, they don't say how many trains have to make it.
So just to be clear, if a single train went from Los Angeles to San Francisco in the appointed time, that would meet the provisions of Prop 1A. Wouldn't be an ideal system. I think we can all agree on that.
Yes, it says, I believe, it says without stopping. Yes, that's correct. And that's what it's designed for.
So if any time of the day or night, 24 hours in a day, a train can make its way from Los Angeles to San Francisco in the allotted time, then we've complied technically with Prop 1A. So that takes that challenge off the table in my judgment, because we can clearly make that happen. Not suggesting for a minute that's what you want to produce or that that's what we want to see. So now we're back to the CEQA issue, which was the third piece of the proposal. And we've had a circular conversation on this, in my judgment, and I want to see if we can stop chasing ourselves around the table on this conversation. Here's the challenge. To date, the High-Speed Rail Authority has insisted on doing a environmental analysis for what it calls full build-out of a phased system. I think that's a fair characterization. The point that Assemblymember Gordon and Congresswoman Eshoo and I made was we need to scale down the project to something that can be accommodated within the existing right-of-way and that does not involve an aerial viaduct, and that works using the existing system, both to avoid costs and impacts. We've also then said, in the third point that's made, that we called on the authority to abandon its preparation of an EIR for a phased project of larger dimensions over a 25-year time frame. The authority then comes back and says, relying on its legal counsel, that's your cue, relying on its legal counsel, that no, we have to do the EIR for the full phased project. To which I then say, you wouldn't have to do that EIR if you scaled back your definition of a project. To which you then say, but we have to comply with Prop 1A, to which I then say, you can comply with Prop 1A as a legal matter. So I'm going to turn to you and or your staff and or your legal counsel and say, is it your view that CEQA requires you to do an EIR for a project you do not propose to build? And if the answer to that question is no, because I'm thinking it's going to be no, then if we simply scale back the project, aren't we able to scale back the EIR? And the reason for this question is, I don't want to see an EIR proceed for a project that is never going to be built, that probably never should be built, but that puts a sword over the head of every property owner up and down this very developed 50-mile stretch of the corridor. Clear enough? So let's go to either you or your legal counsel.
If I may, Senator, purely technically, we couldn't even travel between San Francisco and San Jose in 30 minutes. You would have to rebuild the alignment to achieve that.
Well, you've talked about using the existing corridor for what you call Phase 1, as I understand it, and moving trains up and down that corridor at 120 miles per hour.
No, we wouldn't be running at 120 miles an hour initially in Phase 1, in the first phase. We would have to rebuild that corridor to be able to get to those speeds.
And what does rebuild that corridor mean?
There are many bridges, tunnels, alignments, curves that have to be changed and completely rebuilt.
Okay, but you're still talking about staying substantially within the right of way to do that,
and
you're still talking about avoiding a viaduct. And so we're not talking about a multi-billion-dollar mega project. We're talking about staying substantially within the right of way, avoiding a viaduct, and moving a train at 124 miles an hour, am I remembering? And 124 miles an hour over, I'm going to call that 50 miles, is that fair?
That's right.
Okay. So if we were talking about that, then you can do that in 30 minutes.
Yes, if you rebuild, yes.
Okay. So understanding that it's not as if we're going to take your 21st century Caltrain and put it on those squeaky old tracks that are still there. Excuse me, your 21st century high-speed rail program, put it on those squeaky old tracks. But you can, in fact, make it in half an hour from San Francisco to San Jose without building a viaduct and still staying substantially within the right-of-way, yes?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
And if you can do it at 120 more miles an hour, you can get 50 miles in less than half an hour. And if you can do it in less than half an hour, you can comply with Prop 1A.
On that point, but not on the others.
Well, not on the others because?
Because the others require that I be able to transition stations.
And just to be clear, because there's been either some misunderstanding or misperception or misrepresentation about the proposal is to have people stay on the same train when they arrive in San Jose and move north to San Francisco. So south of San Jose, for the moment, and I understand that it will be an issue because I've got colleagues who've got interest in other parts of the geography, but south of there is not what I'm talking about. You told me in order to make it work, you had to be able to get from San Jose to San Francisco in half an hour, and we've now established that you can do that without building the multi-billion-dollar subsequent phases with the aerial viaduct outside the right-of-way.
Right.
To which I then say, great, why would we be pursuing an EIR for that scope of a project when there's no plan, when I'm suggesting, and others have suggested, that the plan should be scaled back to avoid the need to go in that direction? Let me just add, it's Ms. Aitchison?
Yes, that's correct.
And tell us a little bit about who you are and where you came from, what your practice is.
You go first for that.
Sure. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. My name is Danae Aitchison. I'm a Deputy Attorney General with the Land Law Section of the Attorney General's Office. And attorneys from the Land Law Section of the office provide the authority with counsel on its environmental compliance with various matters, particularly its compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act. So I'm here today in my capacity as counsel to the client, not speaking for the office with a capital A and a capital G, but as counsel for the client on the environmental law issues.
So let me ask the question.
Certainly.
Does the High Speed Rail Authority, and I love this, I'm getting free legal advice, so this is nothing but helpful. Does the High Speed Rail Authority have to do an environmental assessment for a project it does not propose to build? That's a straight-out question, and I'd appreciate a straight-up answer.
I will do my very best to give you a straight-up answer. The High Speed Rail Authority is an entity, like other state agencies, that can propose projects. It's proposing a project. It's a public project. The definition of that project is one that has to comply with the governing laws that it's operating under. It has to build the system that's set out for it in law to build. Assuming that the proposal on the table for a project complies with all of that, then the agency has discretion to determine exactly how it might want to phase that implementation of that project, but it always has to be studying under CEQA the full extent of reasonably foreseeable impacts of the whole project. So it really comes...
Stopping, please.
Okay.
Key phrase, whole project.
Yes.
So, just to be clear, and if I restate what you've told me in a way that you think is incorrect or misleading, I want to give you every opportunity to correct it. So if the project were scaled back, and if it could be scaled back in a way that was compliant with 1A, then the only environmental assessment that would be necessary is for that scaled back project, as long as the scaled back project is compliant technically and legally with Prop 1A.
I think that's correct, but let me add one other thing, which is it wasn't entirely clear from the proposal regarding the time horizon issue and planning and doing environmental review out to the 2035 time frame. Now, I don't know if that's an aspect of this discussion here.
This is why I say this has been a circular conversation, and I think my goal is to make it to stop, as I say, chasing around the table on this issue. I think the candor that Mr. vanArk has provided and the candid answer you've given make it pretty clear. You do not have to do environmental assessment work for a project you are not proposing. And if you would recast the proposal, provided it is consistent with Prop 1A, then the environmental assessment work need only be done to the extent and scope of the recast proposal. We're clear on that?
I think we are clear on that, sir. The only key is that the time horizon, under CEQA, it is required that as you're studying the whole of the action that's on the table, even if phased, you have to examine the reasonably foreseeable impacts.
And what I'm saying is, and what the proposal from the three elected officials says is, there's a phase, and then you're done. And we're not talking about going beyond that with the multi-billion-dollar viaduct project that goes well outside the existing right-of-way. And if the High-Speed Rail Authority said, you know what, we're prepared to accept that as our project, even looking out over the long-term horizon, then that is the reduced project that they would then be obliged to do environmental work on, yes?
Yes, the key, of course, is whether or not the definition of that project would meet the design characteristics for the system that are set forth in the law.
In Prop 1A.
Correct.
Yes. Great. Then I think we're headed down a good conversational path. Let me use a slightly more easily defined project. Have you ever been to the city of Palo Alto, where I live?
I certainly have. I'm
Great.
a Stanford alum.
Great. Well, then you're familiar with what we call the Palo Alto process. In Palo Alto, we like to say that process is our most important product, actually, and I think Mr. vanArk has been discovering that since his arrival in the community. If someone came to the Palo Alto City Council and said, I want to build a 400-unit condominium project. I want to do 200 units, and then 20 years from now, I want to come back and do another 200 units. You and I think, would agree that they have to do environmental assessment work for a 400-unit project, right?
I'm not sure I caught that. For the whole of the project?
For the whole of the project.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. But suppose the Palo Alto City Council said, as it might, you know, sorry, folks, you're only going to get to do 200 units. And you're only going to get to do 200 units, period, end of story, and that's what we're approving. Would the environmental assessment work only be for 200 units?
Well, under that particular circumstance, if your private applicant were to essentially withdraw, then the answer would be yes. And I think that's the question.
Let me just use a different phrase.
Okay.
If my private applicant were essentially to downsize his project from 400 units to 200 units and understand that that was the limited scope of the project, then that's the only thing that they'd be doing an EIR for, right?
Yes, that's correct. And the distinction would be, under that scenario, you may or may not have similar, legal implications for what is or isn't required as a public project. So here the authority is operating, as you have already identified, under the design characteristics of Prop 1A.
I think we're in my view, a much better place than we have been for a while, which is, I think we have clarity that the authority's position is that it has to deliver a project that is technically compliant with Prop 1A. And by the way, I see our Assembly colleague, Assemblymember Galgiani. I'm sorry I didn't see you through the rail and the bodies, but welcome and thank you for being here. I appreciate your interest. We have to build a project that's, the authority's view is we have to build a project that's compliant with 1A, and we have to do an environmental assessment that would be compliant with CEQA for a Prop 1A compliant project. And to which I would then say, great, let's have a conversation about what a Prop 1A compliant project might look like that doesn't look like what is currently being proposed for phase implementation between the time of today and the year 2035. Thank you. Senator Lowenthal, now that you've learned more about the area I live in than you ever had hoped to, any comments or questions?
This has been an ongoing education seminar.
Thank you.
This is not a one-time
For all of us. For all of us.
education. So I'm just enjoying the process and seeing how agreement is arrived at, and I'm very impressed.
Ms. Fuller, anything on this issue?
Actually, are we ready to move to Southern California for a moment?
We are. Once we finish this item up, I want to give these folks a moment to pause, catch their breath. But unless you have questions about this issue, what I would like to do is go to public comment on this issue. And actually, I think probably the best bet would be to say, if folks who wanted to offer comment could offer comment just sort of roughly first on this issue, if that's what they choose to speak to, and then others who have comments on high-speed rail, because we have a number of other items that follow. And let's get all of the public comment resolved, and then we'll go to members who have other issues for either the statewide implementation or for local aspects. Do we have members of the public who are here today to speak to this issue?